Greetings, true believers, and welcome to another episode of Dan Dashley Discusses, the comic review show where I tell you if a book's worth buying, borrowing, or skipping. It's a simple system we got here. I'm a simple man. Let's just get right on with the review. That's why you're here. That's why I'm here. What else do you need? This week, we're reviewing a book that I know a lot of people, myself included, were rather excited for. And that's We Stand on Guard by Brian K. Vaughan. Brian K. Vaughan, for those of you who don't know, is just about the biggest name in comic books right now. Saga's hugely popular. He did Y the Last Man, which is also insanely popular. Ex Machina, same boat. And he did my personal favorite comic of all time, the first volume of The Runaways. Vaughan teamed up with artist Steve Scrocha on this one, and they created this book, We Stand on Guard. We Stand on Guard is a book that takes place in the far futures in Canada. I know that's the most appealing setting for anyone who reads comics, myself included. Basically, shit goes down at the White House, it gets burned down, and the American government bombs Canada in retaliation. We follow two survivors of the bombing of Ontario, a brother and a sister, who were alive to witness the event. Their whole family dies in the bombing, and they swear an oath to always have each other's back, as things get worse and worse in Canada. After this introduction to the characters, we jump forward to an even farther future. We just see the girl, her name is Amber. She's sort of doing the whole wilderness survival and messed up future thing. You know how these types of stories go. One thing leads to another, she's found by a rebel organization, they fight some giant robots, someone dies, she joins the rebel organization. I mean, it's all pretty basic. These are things that happen in everyday life. All in all, the actual plot of We Stand on Guard is akin to any generic action movie, any Call of Duty title, really any first-person shooter when you think about it. Vague government actions, bad guys, shoot, kill, action. And I think that that's what Brian K. Vaughan was going for, so in that regard, he did succeed. And I will say that the plot of this book is actually rather fast-paced. We get the bombing of Canada happening in, the first 3 pages. Then, boom, we move to a slightly more future Canada with Amber. A couple pages later, she's already killed a giant robot with these rebels, and there's already an even bigger robot. The fast-paced plot is actually really good in this instance, because it makes the reader not care too much about the vague details and why this war has actually started. And the actual reason for America invading and occupying Canada, they said, is water. Which, I know we all know water is going to be a big resource in the future as the population goes up. Freshwater supplies go down, yada yada. But whether or not it's actually that important to make America attack one of its chief allies, I don't know. But then again, I'm not a real political guy. I discuss comic books. I don't really discuss the politics behind them. But like I said, this is basically a Call of Duty game in a comic form with a giant robot. I will say, though, that my praise for how fast the plot is about where my praises end for the actual writing of this book. To be perfectly frank, the characters themselves are not particularly interesting because we don't know enough about them. They're fairly one-dimensional. Our main character, Amber, we know almost nothing about other than she hates America, like all Canadians do in this future of occupation. She's devoted to her brother, I'm assuming, based on the dialogue at the beginning of the book. And we know that she knows how to handle a crossbow to hunt and to kill a robot. And the characters in this rebel force that she ends up joining are pretty underdeveloped too. We've got the hard, badass leader girl, who's also the tech person. We have an actor who only speaks French. And while I don't speak French, given how short and infrequent his lines are, I guarantee you that we don't learn that much about his character. And then we have a guy who's a big comic book nerd who's really into Superman. Who these characters are, what their organization is doing, is almost glossed over. It seems to not be that important to the actual book as issue 1. I'm hoping that changes. But as of right now, it's hard to call these fleshed out characters. And that's really where one of the biggest issues for this book comes from for me. I'm not particularly invested in these characters or their struggle because I know so little about it. All we're told is America is bombing Canada, they want their water, they're evil, here's why you should hate them. And I can certainly sympathize with an anti-war, anti-occupation plot. That's something that actually happens in the real world, so we can relate to that, and we know how we feel about that. But this book doesn't do a good enough job of actually telling us what's going on to motivate us to care. In addition to that, some of the messages are actually rather heavy-handed. Characters say that America was only interested in the water or the resources. That's a little too much like our occupation in the Middle East. The obvious parallels are obvious, and that makes for a rather uninteresting read because the author is hitting you over the head with these beliefs and ideals. Even if you don't want to read about them in that kind of context. It's boring. It's uninteresting. Really, a lack of subtlety is one of my biggest issues with this book. In order to establish that it's Canada, Brian K. Vaughan shows us Tim Hortons. Amber's brother is reading The Outside, sort of mirroring that Amber is going to end up being this wandering the wilderness killing dudes type of character. Brian K. Vaughan has never really been a master of subtlety. Look at the opening page of Saga, for God's sake. But in this book, it's particularly apparent. And a lack of subtlety can be an enjoyable style. But for a book like this, dealing with heavy political issues and bringing real countries into the mix, I just don't think that lack of subtlety does Brian K. Vaughan any favors. And now I'm going to discuss what I think the biggest offender is in the writing of this book. One of the characters from 2-4, this rebel organization, takes off a piece of his shirt to cover one of Amber's wounds. He has a tattoo of Superman's shield. Amber proceeds to question why he would have that, given that Superman stands for truth, justice, and the American way. The man then goes on a prolonged rant about how Superman stands not for the American ideals, but for Canadian ideals specifically, because he was created by a Canadian. My main issue with this is that it undermines exactly what Superman actually does stand for. Any reader or fan of Superman will know that he doesn't stand for the American way, in that America is the greatest, #1, we should rule the whole globe type of deal. Superman represents a set of ideals that every human on Earth should have and act on. This ideal of a perfect man, who's kind, who's strong and gentle, who protects the innocent and the weak and punishes the unjust. Superman is a global ideal. He's not an American ideal. He's not a Canadian ideal. He's not an Irish or a German or a South African ideal. Superman is a global force. And Brian K. Vaughan should know better than that. He's a longtime comic book reader and a writer. He's not unfamiliar with how Superman actually is. And in fact, it's this gap in logic that has caused DC in the past to bring up the fact that Superman isn't an American force, he isn't any one country's force, he's a global force. Superman renounced his American citizenship in a comic, for God's sakes, Brian K. Vaughan. No one country gets to claim that Superman stands for their ideals. DC has made a point of this. Comic book readers in general know this. Why are you bringing to light such a misguided point? And you know, maybe having that one particular character miss the point of Superman is the point, that people misrepresent this ideal of Superman all the time. But for my money, as a Superman fan and a longtime comic book reader, I don't think that point's worth a damn. It doesn't add anything to the plot. It doesn't particularly add anything to the character, other than we know that he's a big Superman and comic book fan, and it doesn't add anything to anyone else's character. So why even have it in there? Okay, so now that rant's over, I'd like to move on to the art of this book, which I certainly think is the book's best aspect. Though even then, I don't think that the art carries this book in most regards. In this book, Steve Skroce has managed to do some things particularly well. First and foremost, I'd like to bring up the fact that he manages to perfectly portray the Canadian tundra. It's vast, expansive, isolating, lonely, cold. Whenever there are these large tundra shots, you feel the absolute desperation that landscape can portray. Having a landscape like that is a very delicate balance. You have to know how to have enough so that we instantly recognize where the setting is, but at the same time, you can't have too much and risk it not feeling so desolate and isolated. Tundras and deserts are a very difficult environment to draw, and Skroce does a perfect job of doing so. On top of that, the designs that he used for the American robots are rather interesting. They have this sort of utility feel about them. They're shaped in such a way that moving through this Canadian landscape won't exactly pose a threat to these large lumbering machines. At the same time, though, they have this animalistic appeal that makes them frightening, engaging, and I'd gather that it sort of is drawing an obvious parallel to the animalistic nature of war itself. And on top of that, his grasp of how humans should look in anatomy is rather on par, though I will say that none of these characters in particular has a rather striking profile. I think that that's a big negative in a book. I like to be able to pick out a character from a lineup easily, and he doesn't really have any characters stand out in that regard. There are also some inconsistencies with his art. For instance, in this one panel, Amber shoots an arrow from her crossbow, and the back of it looks like it's from a damn Nerf gun. Meanwhile, in another panel, it looks like a perfectly normal arrow. This might sound a bit nitpicky, but consistencies like that tell us what a weapon's used for and what it does. And I think that the actual weapon choices that a character has tells us a lot about how that character chooses to fight, and therefore it tells us a lot about that character in general. So having a weapon look one way consistently does tell us a lot about a character, I feel. And at the beginning of the book with the bombing of Ontario, I felt that some of the actual gore itself didn't exactly look appealing or very natural. I will say that the biggest hero of this book in terms of art is Matt Hollingworth. He's the colorist on this book, and he manages to do a phenomenal job as well. The whites that he uses for the snow in Canada are so perfect. They're somber, cold, almost all-encompassing. These whites chill you to the bone. He does also manage to make the gunmetal gray of these robots a rather striking and fear-inducing color. And then there are a lot of instances in which his pinks and reds are flush and full when they need to be during gratuitous action or violence, and at the same time he knows when to dial it back and have it be more subdued. Hollingworth overall brings a lot to this book, and I feel like the coloring is one of the main things that kept me engaged with these characters in these environments. And my last shout out actually goes to Phonographics, who did the lettering for this. While the lettering didn't blow my mind in every aspect, I think that the word bubble and font choices for the robots was right on par and made them sound robotic and cold, as opposed to the warmth that the actual characters' dialogue had. It's a pretty basic technique, but one that added a lot to this comic book's feel. So, what does We Stand on Guard look like as a whole? While I'm sure a lot of you were thinking that this review was overly negative, I like to think that this is a book that has plenty of potential. Brian K. Vaughan as an author often has to get into his stride first before a book really hits its highest point. I look at the first issue of Runaways or the first issue of Saga and then compare those to some of their later issues, and it's clear how much the series has evolved as Brian's been able to flesh out his ideas. I hope that he does dial back some of the heavy-handedness that we see in this first issue. I hope that that was more of a product of him wanting us to get acclimated with the actual universe and the themes that he's exploring. Though, as I said before, subtlety isn't always Brian K. Vaughan's strongest suit, so we'll have to see where that goes from there. The art in this book is rather interesting, though nothing particularly to write home about. It does the job, sometimes rather well. But that's really the biggest praise that I can give the art as a whole. It's not going to blow your mind, but you're not going to put the book down because of the art. So I'm sure by now a lot of you are thinking that I'm going to go ahead and give this book a skip it. And that's not really the case. All in all, I think that We Stand on Guard is the book that's worth your time. It doesn't take that long to read, and you're not going to lament the 10-20 minutes that you spent on this book. Brian K. Vaughan's a talented enough writer that anything that you read with his name on it is likely going to be a good use of your time. At the same time, though, I'm not going to go ahead and tell you to rush out and buy this book while it's still on shelves, though since it's a Brian K. Vaughan book, it'll probably be off shelves almost immediately after it comes out. This book has a lot of issues, and it needs time to grow, and unless you're just in it for the action, this book's going to take a while for it to grow on you. For all those reasons, I'm actually going to go ahead and give We Stand on Guard a borrow it. A part of me is cautiously optimistic about this book. Given enough time with the concept that he loves, Brian K. Vaughan can do a lot of good. And We Stand on Guard certainly has the potential for all of those things and more. With a more fleshed out universe, a more fleshed out cast of characters, and some interesting fight sequences and themes, this book could become a bestseller. I guarantee it. But as for issue 1, it's just not there for me yet. And I think because of that, waiting for the trade is certainly the best way to go about reading this book. I'm sure that's not the most popular opinion out there. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there telling you that just because Brian K. Vaughan's name is on this book, that it's the second coming of Jesus, the second coming of Saga. And in terms of popularity, who knows, it might end up being. But for my money, let's wait this one out. Buy the trade, borrow the book until then. It's certainly worth a read at the very least. So that's actually all we have time for this week, True Believers. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, all the things that we have. Links are down in the description. And let me know what you thought about this book. Do you think it's worth a buy, a borrow, a skip? Brian K. Vaughan's a huge author, so I'm sure a lot of you have already read this book, so I'm sure you have opinions on it. Go ahead and share them below. I'm interested in what you have to say about this book. And remember, if you have any requests for what you want me to review next, just leave a comment down below and I'll get to it right away. So do all those things, and I will see you later, True Believers.